So I've studied social movements for the past 4 years because I think if we look back on history, any changes that have happened, any significant changes that have happened in history, have always had social movements behind them. So I've been studying social movements, as I said, since 2014, 2015. And when XR came along, I went to the April Rebellion, and I was absolutely blown away by the ethos of XR, non-violent disruptive action and direct action. I thought that was very powerful repertoires of collective action. So I joined. I'm part of XR Lambeth, and I'm part of the Engaging Communities group. My particular interest is to explore why environmental movements have this diversity deficiency syndrome, as I call it, why there's a lack of black and brown people particularly involved in environmental movements. So I've been exploring that, and yeah, that's my angle in terms of involvement with XR Lambeth. Pretty much everything I do and I look at has a justice angle to it. So I want to see justice sort of within and between societies around the world. So that's pretty much what I do. As Frederick Douglass once said, you know, power makes no concessions without a demand. So unless we demand change from or concessions from power, you know, we will not get the change. People with power have vested interest in continuing the status quo. Part of my analysis with my research is that obviously business as usual, as framed with sustainable development or however development we like to look at it, is grounded in GDP, is grounded in seeing development as growth. Now there is an intrinsic problem with that, because within development as growth there are a lot of contradictions where nature is expropriated for use value, sorry, it's for profit value, not use value, and there's a big problem with that. We need to try and have good, meaningful dialogue with people in power, because unfortunately the state normally has a monopoly on violence, and so if we have violent actions, they will clamp down hard on us. So we need to try and engage people with power, and the only way the people who have the real power actually are the masses, not the people at the very top. So we need to try, again, engage everyone at the bottom, so to speak, and if we have a powerful enough movement, a powerful enough demand, we can, as Frederick Douglass said, make that demand to the people at the top. I am quite radical. I am very radical actually in terms of wanting to dismantle all the institutions of power and relocalize power, you know, the power structures, take it back to localities. I would encourage them to listen to the scientists, look at the evidence, look at the listen to the truth, as it were. There is a lot of empirical evidence out there suggesting that our development model, business as usual, has exacted almost an irreversible damage on the planet, and therefore we need to address this issue. So they need to actually look at the evidence, look at the empirical evidence, and not be tethered to profit seen as growth, or sorry, development seen as growth which is of course led by consumption. Within XR, a lot of what I've found, and my research will actually be published next year, a lot of what I've found has been to do in terms of attracting racial minority groups and racial minority people, has been to do with how we frame the story, how we frame our demands. And I think we need to amplify the justice elements, because what we are talking about really within XR and other movements really are issues of justice. We're talking about justice right now, today, here and now, and we're also talking about justice in the future. We're also talking about justice between societies. So for example, we have a world system at the moment which extracts a lot of raw materials from the global south and then takes it to semi-peripheral countries where materials are made and then exported to the core countries, which are Occidental countries in the global north. Once these things are used, like computers, phones, and so on and so forth, they are shipped back almost always to the periphery countries to be disposed of. So whilst we think we are making great gains, we're making great leaps and bounds in terms of how we address climate change, and we, for example, the UK boasts that our emissions are low and so on and so forth. They're not. You know, we are exporting our entropy, we are exporting our waste into the global south for them to deal with, which is quite paradoxical to think that the raw materials were extracted in the first place from the peripheral countries, and then turned into these materials, you know, all to do with consumption, overconsumption in the global north. And that is very problematic. John Rawls wrote a book, you know, his seminal book, which a lot of people turn to in terms of looking at or trying to unpack justice, is justice as fairness. His argument was justice as fairness. But also we can look to scholars such as Nancy Fraser who bring out justice as participation or justice as recognition. And I'm very much in the camp of recognition, because recognizing the unjust ways of distribution or unjust ways of the global, how the world is organized in terms of recognition, is very appropriate in terms of getting participation and fairness addressed as well. I went into my research with my focus on transition towns movements. Now, the transition towns movement is a movement that is a very positive movement, looks at solutions. So with transition ethos, we very much look at Buckminster Fuller's aphorism that to change something, there's no use in fighting the existing powers or existing something. Build an alternative model that makes the existing model look obsolete. So I was very much drawn to that, and so I went into transition town movement. But a critique I would have of the transition movement is that the solutions we're providing at the community level are not challenging the existing systems enough, and especially if we don't get enough people within the wider community involved. XR came up with some very, what I call a kaleidoscopic repertoire of collective actions. You know, that's, you could not ignore, you cannot ignore the collective actions that repertoires that XR has. Now we need to look at the processes involved in, you know, collective action in order to make it truly a mass movement that will have the effect, the desired effect.